Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event on what global cooperation to support accelerated national climate action with insights from emerging economies. I'm Lauren Harry-Villen from IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and part of the DDP initiative. We have many distinguished speakers here today. Thank you for coming and for taking the time. I will present all of them as I go through the agenda. So our event today will be in several parts. First, we'll have a presentation of insights for international cooperation needs to accelerate climate action in emerging economies based on the DDP annual report 2023 by Johannes Svensson, who is also part of the DDP initiative. Then we will have two in-country research team leads who are part of the DDP network, who are going to provide perspectives on the priority transformations that need to be accelerated for national ambitious pathways in their countries and the types of international cooperation needed to for these to happen. So here today we have two countries. We'll have presentations on two countries, Brazil and Argentina. The presentation on Brazil will be by Professor Emilio Lebre-Lavere, who is the head of Centro Clima at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And on Argentina, we'll have Francisco Lalana, who is associate professor at Fundación Bariloche. We'll then have sectoral insights and also the perspective on South Africa on those sectoral insights by Hilton Trolip, who is an independent consultant and our industry expert at the DDP. And last but not least, we'll have a presentation by Daniel Bruera, who is the director of Tempus Analytica, and he's going to work on the link, present about the link of our approach with the current climate agenda, and especially the GST. So before we start, I just want to remind participants that you can ask your questions on Slido. You should have a link on your screen, platform on your screen. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. And after all these presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. So let's start. Johannes, I'll give you the floor now on an introduction of our topic.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I don't see my slides. There I see it. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So yeah, the topic I will talk about is on innovative international cooperation for accelerating national transformations, which is also the title of a report that we, as the DDP network, released very recently. So next slide, please. So first of all, I want to elaborate a bit on what is the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. So basically, it's an international network of national experts and practitioners. We have active collaborations with a broad number of in-country research teams. As you see on the slide, the countries marked dark red are the countries that we have active collaborations with, but also a broader network of kind of in-country research partners, some of which are here today, of course. We also have in the network international partners that either come in a capacity of expert modelers or sectoral experts or in some other capacities. But basically, that's the network. I want to emphasize that it's country-driven, country-led, and country-owned, as we say. It's really driven by the national visions, and so is the work that I will present here. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So more concretely then, basically the work that we've done here we build together with the based on the work of the in-country or the in-country partners build national pathways for their own countries. These pathways are defined by the in-country teams, and this is important to underscore because it makes sure that the pathways takes into account the national circumstances and reflect the national priorities. They are quantitative and qualitative, and this I also underscore because it helps integrating certain elements that are hard to quantify, including, for instance, socioeconomic elements and so on. There are also long-term pathways, often leading up to 2050 or a bit beyond, but with the objective of informing short-term decisions. So based on a number of national low greenhouse gas development pathways, we did a synthetic analysis to identify what are the common key transformations per sector. So again, I emphasize this work was done in a sectoral way. And so basically per sector, what's the key transformations that are common to a multitude of countries? And to draw insights, kind of bottom-up insights for international cooperation, we then identified areas of international cooperation that can help speed up and accelerate the key common national transformations that are common across the different countries. So next slide, please. Basically, based on this, we're able to draw some lessons. The first one is that we need systemic transformations of a number of sectors. And these systemic transformations for deep decarbonization are not possible without adequate international conditions. So we see this in the national pathways, and this is also reinforced by the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. We also see that currently these necessary international conditions that are revealed by the national scenarios are often not in place as of today. So this also echoes well with the technical summary report of the global stocktake released a few months ago. So this leads us to the conclusion that we need more and better international cooperation to effectively support accelerated in-country action. So next slide, please. And based on this, we've identified some key features of this innovative international cooperation. So the first one is that it must be based on country needs. So I mean, international cooperation, something that we really see today is that it must respond better to the needs defined by different countries. So in a way, international cooperation must have more of a bottom-up character, and this is an element that is insufficient today, and so must be reinforced going forward. The second point that we wanna underscore is that international cooperation must not all international cooperation, but more of it must take a sectoral and systemic approach. And this because we see that systemic transformations are necessary and are more important they clearly is what is needed over and above kind of marginal tweaks of different sectors. We need systemic transformations, and sectoral cooperation is best placed to support this. International cooperation also needs to be holistic and encompass a variety of tools on a needs basis. And lastly, must target action both in the short and in the long term. So, I mean, there we also see a risk that we either over focus on the short term at the expense of the long term, or vice versa. Neither of which will take us to our end goal. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, COP28 is ongoing. This is an important moment for a reinforcement of international cooperation, because what we see is that this has to happen quick. I mean, we're not gonna. Other people have emphasized the urgency of accelerated action, so I don't have to do that here. But clearly, the changes that we need to see in international cooperation must happen quickly for us to have a chance of staying within the 1.5 target. And COP28 should be a turning point. That said, the UNFCCC is not where all the changes will happen. There are other forums for international cooperation, but the UNFCCC will play a key role in sending a political signal, catalyzing processes, and creating accountability, and so on. But with that was kind of the framework of some of this work. But we also have my dear colleagues in the room who will come in and provide some further illustration of what is it more in detail that I'm talking about here. So with that, I hand over to them, to Laura, and back to.
Thank you, Johannes. That was very clear. And so you made the transition already. So I'll hand over directly to Professor Emilio for your presentation on Brazil.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, you see my presentation, as Johannes explained. I provide some insights on our national analysis in Brazil. Next slide, please. As previously presented, we have worked in this deep decarbonization scenarios, first at the national level, according to a global narrative, and also national qualitative storylines, identifying barriers to decarbonization and policy instruments to overcome them at the national level, but also enabling conditions at the global level. And we've been also discussing key global enablers that are common to multiple countries and those specific to each country. Next slide, please. So this is a glimpse of the analysis in Brazil. You see the graph of emissions, overall economic-wide emissions split by main source. In blue, you have agriculture emissions dominated by methane emissions from livestock primarily, which are difficult to abate. In green, you have emissions from land use and land use change, mainly deforestation in the Amazon and Brazilian savanna. We know how to tackle the challenge and reduce these emissions as we did in the past. It's not easy, but it's a sector that can, on the contrary, become a net sink from 2040 in Brazil and help to compensate for the residual emissions of other sectors. You also see that emissions from transport and energy supply in orange and red can be quite reduced. Emissions in industry, not so much, but still there are some hard to abate sectors, and also in waste. So we have in Brazil the possibility to reach net zero through a combination of existing available technologies. Next slide, please. And most importantly, referring to the results of our general equilibrium economic model, and based on input-output analysis developed with French Corporation of CIRED, the International Center on Environment and Development based in Paris, we see that we can reach that result by 2050 with no harm to GDP, employment, and with slight inflation, increasing the general price index, and with a pretty low carbon price in the case of Brazil, which is lower than in the deep decarbonization scenarios, which of course requires carbon pricing as a policy tool. We have less than $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent by 2030 and less than 50 by 2050. Next slide, please. So we derive from these results priority short-term policies, as mentioned by Johannes, and we, for instance, in curbing down the annual deforestation rates, we know that a mix of and control and economic instruments can confine us, but particularly capital costs are very high and try to de-risk the investments for decarbonization, and for that smart financial mechanisms can help. We also need carbon pricing, of course, and relying in forest restoration in afforestation schemes to make the FLU sector to become a net sink. Next slide, please. The key findings from the Brazilian deep decarbonization scenario is, of course, this is just one among many other possible potential pathways to get there, is that we can do that with the underlying assumption of just deployment of available technologies with no needs of breakthroughs in disruptive technologies, no need of CCS, no need of other difficult to make feasible technologies, and at a low carbon price. And this provides some, this backcasting approach provides some milestones for monitoring, report, and verification schemes, and also to check the co-benefits for mainly the helping to achieve some sustainable development goals. And the main challenges are related to capital cost to get the due amount of climate finance in the magnitude, but also in the modalities that are appropriate to actually increase very substantially the amount of decarbonization deployment and technologies. And we have, of course, challenges as well of political acceptability within the country as everywhere. Next slide, please. Finally, what would be required to from the world as global enablers to make this possible in Brazil is mainly the supply of international finance for investment in affordable conditions. So, for instance, just energy transition partnerships can provide that together with the Amazon Fund. And it's also welcome to have some international cooperation and trade mechanisms to support the goal of net zero deforestation in Brazil, and including preferential trade mechanisms for low carbon products, of course requiring traceability and proof of origin for agriculture and forestry product exports to the world. Next slide, please. And finally, as last slide brings to work together on these financial mechanisms to fund decarbonization actions in Brazil, but going beyond the Amazon Fund. like potential just energy transition partnerships to fund the low carbon infrastructure and to continue and to supply the amount of finance needed for getting to net zero energy supply and transport and waste and sanitation projects, which will consume a lot of upfront costs, investments in the future. And the compatibility between CBAM with the Brazilian cap and trade carbon market, that of course there are possibilities of joint working groups in the framework of the European Mercosur agreement to work to go and overcome the potential for conflictual regulations, and there will be need for some modernization. Brazil will probably need to create also border taxes, and the same with the European directive on constraining exports of products with a deforestation footprint. And there are different certification programs, both internationally, but also in Brazil. And I think we need to work together in terms of targets and timetables. Otherwise, these schemes have a risk. Our concern is that if there is no feasible technological and economical option, this will just lead to prices increase, creating inflation in both sides of the ocean, which will not serve the climate goals neither, and slow down the economy, which is not a good result, of course. And finally, the EU directive also provides some positive incentives to reward good practice. And again, we can work on that to really scale up the good practice and increase the supply of zero deforestation products from Brazil and to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very interesting, especially how net zero is reachable with a combination of technologies that already exist, and that would not have a negative impact on the economy, etc. And your ideas on how international cooperation could help move that forward. I just want to remind participants that you can use this Slido to ask your questions directly, and that we will have time at the end to address them. And with that, I'll hand over to Fren on your presentation on Argentina.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I will present some results of the Argentinian team of the Imagine project, which was based in the study of the phase down or maybe phase out for the mid-century or maybe a little years more of natural gas. Next slide, please. Natural gas is very important in the Argentinian economy because it's based in the root of the energy system. Since 4 decades, more or less, we had a lot of natural gas, very cheap resource and very flexible resource. So it's impregnated in the entire energy system, coming from the final demand. As you may see in these slides, it's very present in the residential and household sector, but it's very important in the electricity generation. So the abatement of the natural gas or the fade out of natural gas, it's quite important. And in the next slide, please, we will see that with the recent developments, with the recent improvements of natural gas, we found a very cheap technique to produce, to exploit the non-conventional resources of shale gas, which increase the ambition regarding the necessary transformations to fade out natural gas, because with the actual situation, natural gas remains or became the cheapest resource in energy system for Argentina. So it's a double challenge, thinking about the cost, or thinking about the budget to supply the requirements of energy of a low income or middle income developing economy, which would like to develop. So the idea of this study was to frame these situations in some scenarios, and with between or having some modelizations regarding the energy system coupling with the economic model, trying to address the impact of fading, or in more challenging scenario, to fade entirely out the natural gas. This is important, thinking not only in the supply of energy resources, but as well as a tool for development, because the recurrent crisis of stop and go regarding the lack of foreign exchange, we have in Argentina a long story of non-complete development because of the lack of exports. So in this situation, with this natural gas very cheap, it's a very trend scenario to consider this resource as a possibility of development, providing these resources in terms of export. So we analyzed that in one scenario, and we contrasted that scenario with some fade outs of natural gas. So in the next slide, maybe skip the next one, because it's the one that I already told. And let's go straight to the scenarios, which is the slide number 5. So we propose 4 scenarios. In that 4 scenarios, we compare that 4 scenarios, being the scenario number 1, the baseline scenario, with a forecast thinking about the increase of use of natural gas. Next slide, please. The bow scenario, which was the increase in the use of natural gas, which, as I told you, is the very cheap resource for Argentina economy. We contrasted that scenario with the scenario number 2, which is more the political desirable scenario, thinking only in the development of the country and proposing a scenario with a lot of foreign exchange coming from the exploit of resources, an industry which is well known and very mature enough to know for sure that would be a good option, which would be the scenario number 2. We contrast that 2 scenarios with scenario number 3, which is a scenario with a total forbidden in the use of natural gas for the long term. So substituting the natural gas in the residential uses, in some part of the industrial uses, and some part of the private transportation, which is one of the rooms for the natural gas use. And with a more virtuous scenario, which is the scenario number 4, which is in a scenario where the substitution of natural gas, it's due to the production of a new energy vector, which could come from foreign investments with certain agreements on that foreign investment. And the idea in this presentation is to show you briefly what are the results in terms of reduction of emissions of these 4 scenarios, and the impact in the average GDP per capita that these scenarios provides. So in the next slide, we can see the evolution of the historical GDP per capita in bold line, and in dotted line. And in bold line, we can see in the left axis the evolution of the emissions per capita of our energy system. As you can see in the trend scenario, the emissions started to rise in the midterm because of the increase in the use of natural gas. Once we reach the NDC perspectives, which are committed for 2030, with the first period of stagnating emissions per capita due to the increase in renewables, up to the cost-benefit, the ideal cost-benefit situation. In scenario number 2, which is the political desirable scenario, we can see that the emissions increases a little bit. Next slide, please. Sorry. We can see that emissions increases a little bit in the short term, but using the resources that comes from the exports of natural gas, Argentina could compromise in the mitigation of the end uses of natural gas to the own system, mostly the electricity generation and the residential use of natural gas, and in some niches of industry, providing an important amount of diminution of the emissions per capita, descending around 50%. Scenario number 3 is shown in the next slide, the slide of scenario number 3, which is colored in yellow line. In yellow line, we can see the impact in terms of the absolute substitution in terms of new production of new oil, new natural gas fields, where leads to no export of natural gas, with a substitution of electricity and with a substitution of residential uses as well. But as you can see in the dotted line, with a very hard impact, or at least a very hard impact in comparison with the scenario number 2 of the GDP growth and the GDP per capita growth. So it's quite important, the complications that for the macroeconomy could lead this scenario. But scenario number 4 in the next slide is the last scenario, where we can see that it is possible for Argentina to reach an optimum or a desirable scenario in the next slide, sorry, which is colored in green. This scenario number 4 is a scenario that reaches some exports in terms of not natural gas products, but in terms of the exploit of the renewable resources that Argentina has, mostly producing hydrogen derivatives, for example, ammonia, but should be based in a very comprehensive system of foreign financing to these investments. I think that in this scenario we can see that yes, please, you can go to the next one. We can see that the results of GDP, or the economic results, are more or less the same. The NDC are compiled, but in the long term, we understand there is still missing an effort that would be seen in the next click for this same slide, which is the tail that we can observe in the emissions. If you made one click more, we can see that even in scenario 4, there is still more efforts to be needed to be done in the industry sector, which is colored in red, and in the freight transport, it's a very hard to abate system, but it's only under consideration for the Argentinian government or for the Argentinian stakeholders once we have reached the point where the emissions have been diminishing due to the international efforts or the international support with the investment in the green renewables energy situation. So to resume this presentation, in the next slide I can show you some key takeaways. These takeaways are more or less the resume of the scenarios that I showed, but the key message maybe it's that we aim to go through a scenario number 4 to a situation or to a transformation of our energy system, like is shown in scenario number 4, which is more or less in the macroeconomic impact, more or less the same than export natural gas. But the only situation here is that the natural gas exports and the increase and the development boost that this natural gas exploits could provide are evaluated to the natural investment or the natural interest rate that our economy has for the energy project or for the infrastructure projects, which are more or less the 12%. With that interest rate, the developments for hydrogen are not self-financed, are not cost benefit. So we need some specific investment at lowest interest rate, more or less at 3 or 4%, were our calculations. which are the enabler conditions for that situation, with an additional quota of some of these green products to have some markets in the world. So the situation is difficult, but the message could be clear in terms of once the investment could start with this type of rentability, which is very different than the historical one, our country or our system could transform into in the correct direction. So we have some future modeling and analysis challenges that I will skip, and I open for questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Fran. That was indeed very clear on how international cooperation can really be a game changer for Argentina here. We'll open for questions after all presentations. But please, once again, participants, please don't hesitate to ask them in the Slido, and I will read them out to our speakers. We'll move on now to our next speaker, who is Hilton here, and who's going to speak about how international cooperation can play an important role on the steel sector, on decarbonizing the steel sector, and with some perspectives from South Africa. Hilton, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, evening to everybody, or night, morning, if you're somewhere else in the world. The topic is international cooperation, and I'm going to talk about very specifically the primary steel production and the need for a global cooperation so that we can achieve global decarbonization of the steel sector, especially in terms of developing countries achieving this. Could you skip to slide 3, please? Thank you. So just as some background, sorry, slide 3 is the slide before that. Sorry, I have, okay. I'm going to give you some background on steel in the world before I continue. So steel's indispensable. It's impossible to provide basic needs to people, both in terms of infrastructure, water, transport, electricity, energy, roads, buildings, without steel. And it's also not possible to industrialize without steel. However, at this stage, the typical industrialized countries have got 10 tons per person of steel in use in their countries, in their bridges and factories, transport systems, etc. South Africa has 2 tons per person, and most African countries have 1 ton. And it's estimated that at least 5 tons is necessary of steel per person, just for basic needs and basic economic production to happen. So large amounts of primary steel, new steel from iron ore, will need to be produced to make up the development backlog and meet primary basic needs in Africa at least, and many other developing countries. Currently, steel production accounts for 8% of global emissions, but it's a hard-to-abate sector, and our scenarios in the DDP show that by 2050, this could be up to 30 or 40% of the carbon budget being used by steel. Can you move to the next slide, please? So up until now, steel was recognized as one of the sectors that was impossible to abate. Even in 2018, the large steel makers said that trying to make steel without emissions from the coal used with making steel was same as trying to make beer without yeast or milk without grass. However, in just 3 years, the European Union has created really special conditions in the European Union and is now set to fully decarbonize steel production with a technology called hydrogen direct reduction. it is, and now I get to the bit about developing countries in the rest of the world. Europe only makes up about 5% of the global population, but we need to move the steel production into the rest of the world, and it isn't moving. We haven't seen investments in decarbonized steel production in any other countries, and certainly not in developing countries. But the work that we've done shows it is quite possible to create the conditions for decarbonized steel production in other countries. Can I have the next slide, please? So basically, the way that this can be done is that the new hydrogen directly reduced iron production allows for the production of iron, which is the first step in making steel. You take iron ore and you make it into iron. That can be split off from the steel making step. And there are many developing countries, such as Brazil, South Africa, Mauritania, and others, that have got large amounts of iron ore and large amounts of low-cost renewable energy. And it makes much more sense for the globalized steel sector to manufacture the iron in those locations and then to export the zero emissions iron to the current production centers such as Europe and the USA. And at the same time, this will accelerate the development of the iron and steel sectors in the developing countries. So, for example, Africa at the moment only makes 40 megatons out of 1,800 megatons of steel per annum. So a huge industrialization of built with steel production is required in Africa and South Africa so that we don't reproduce the same conditions that we produced in the 20th century and the first quarter of this century now, with Africa being grossly underdeveloped because the core economies in Europe, the USA, and then now Japan, China, etc. That is where all the industrialization takes place. There are also other benefits, not just to the developing countries, but the importing industrialized countries would be able to produce steel at a much lower cost than if they make the iron themselves. And similarly, it will accelerate global decarbonization. Next slide, please. So essentially what we need to do at the moment, if you're a steel producer, the conditions that Europe has created with its exceptional wealth and governance capabilities is all of the investments in zero emissions primary iron and steel production are happening in Europe. And but these industrialized economies are formally committed to a level international playing field. And all we need to do is to create this level playing field, in fact, not just commitment. And if we do that, steelmakers would then have the necessary incentives to locate the primary iron manufacturing step in countries such as South Africa or Mauritania, Algeria, Morocco, Brazil, just to name a few, instead of in Europe where it's more expensive to create the steel. To do this, we need firstly to create equal subsidy conditions for the industry, and then secondly, we need trade agreements, because currently the kind of trade agreements or measures being implemented are actually making it more difficult for developing countries such as South Africa to invest in steel, decarbonizing steel, than would be the case without those. So we're actually put at an impossible disadvantage to decarbonize our own industry. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, detailed proposals have been made in our DDP work to create the conditions for global decarbonizations. And the next steps for this would be for these innovative proposals that we have made to be discussed in a more cooperative governance than the current situation where we're getting what I would call a kind of unhealthy competition between industrialized countries and developing countries. And the work that we're doing in DDP will assist with these discussions in cooperative governance fora. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilton. Those were very concrete suggestions. Thank you so much. And so we can link that now with the COP and the current the COP and the current international climate agenda with Daniel's presentation. So if Daniel, you could go a little bit deeper into what the role of the GST should be in pushing this bottom-up needs-based international cooperation forward, and the role of the UNFCCC more generally, and perhaps other UN agencies. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you for this space to the organizers as well. So I will try to link some of these ideas on international cooperation to the GST in two parts, very briefly about how the GST process has just driven our own thinking and helped us pull together some of this bottom up into more general ideas. And I think Johannes has already summarized some of those ideas. And then briefly also on how the GST outcome can impact what we do in future in this space of international cooperation. I did have a slide. Wonderful, there it is. So this slide, very briefly, what this slide does is it displays on the bottom axis the Human Development Index, and on the vertical axis emissions per capita. And what this tells us is that sustainable development means different things for different countries. Perhaps it's obvious, but the direction of travel of different countries will be very different. And we've heard concrete examples. I mean, Fran's example in Argentina on the cost of finance is absolutely not surprising. Latin America is bang in the middle of this chart in the sort of dark blue bubbles. And that shows that you already have a lot of industrial capacity and a lot of assets that have to be decarbonized, but you also have a lot of social challenges, which could impact your interest rates without international cooperation. So I think we can take that slide down for now, and I'll just sort of carry on speaking about some more of these ideas. We've talked about finance as one aspect of international cooperation, and of course, access to technology and capacity building are others. International cooperation is often linked to the so-called means of implementation in the climate change negotiations. But one thing that's become more clear in our work is that international cooperation is, as the IPCC tells us, an enabler in and of itself, not only as an enabler to finance or to capacity building or to technology. And that is because while we've seen some pretty good examples of pathways to real change, we still don't know how to implement all of this change. And these are leading examples. In many developing countries, we still don't have those pathways. We still don't have those industrial pathways, those technology pathways, those economic pathways. So the way we plan has to change. And international cooperation is going to have to be a real team effort to co-develop best practice in planning and in thinking. And the idea of holistic and transformational planning really came through very strongly in the technical dialogue of the GST. And so country-based needs was one of the things that Johannes mentioned. Holistic was another one. And I think this has really been reinforced by the GST technical dialogue. If you scan through, this is in the character of, unfortunately, UN negotiations. If you scan through the GST decision text draft that was released this morning, and you search holistic, it does not appear once in the 24 pages. But let's hope that, that we can make more progress on that. Even if it doesn't appear in the negotiations text, however, it is core to the ideas that came through in the technical dialogue and in much of the analysis that we've done in the DDP. Now, of course, what the GST can do, even if it doesn't give us strict detail and reflect all of the great messages of the technical dialogue, is it can provide a space to invite international cooperation to be discussed and to be promoted and to be improved in line with the Paris Agreement goals. And I expect that this will come through, and it ought to come through. It is that sort of political signal that Johannes mentioned. And what we have to do is to be ready for that. We have to make sure that the key stakeholders of international cooperation, which include development banks, development agencies, donor countries, recipient countries, leading businesses and researchers and civil society, have to be ready to really bring their best thinking and to work together quickly to find new ways to collaborate. And a key idea there that emerges in the DDP work that we've been seeing in these three examples is the idea of in-country economic activity in developing countries. It's very important that this shift in energy systems and this shift in industrial systems has a different profile of investment and of economic activity in terms of developing versus developed countries. Hilton mentioned it very clearly in the case of Africa and steel, but it's true across the board. So if we think of changes such as, say, electric vehicles, there's a real question about international cooperation and, for example, Latin America. There should be scope for cooperation between Latin American countries that have both the resources for lithium batteries, the capabilities and the infrastructure to build cars, the large markets, especially if there can be things like a harmonization of regulation. So an approach of actually having countries work together to create the markets and to take advantage of the opportunities that the transformational changes of 1.5 require really is the space that we have to push forwards on. So I think the way we have to view the GST outcome is really as a starting gun. The GST will point out that we are far behind on all elements of climate action, and the GST will point out to the fact that we need to do more in terms of international cooperation. The detail, however, is up to us. And so I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was really super interesting and also very concrete on the role of the GST and what we can do at this COP. We have 7 minutes left to go through some of the questions that were asked. We have some country-specific questions, but I'll suggest to start with, we'll start with questions that several our speakers can respond to. Maybe we can do a bit of a short answers, if you will, so that we have time for most of the questions, if not all. First, I think this question on kind of going back to the in-country presentations and national presentations on the research that was presented and how to communicate that research and the results of your research to policymakers and stakeholders, both at the national and international level, I thought was interesting. Maybe we can start with Professor Emilio and Fran, and perhaps also Johannes, if you have something to add. Emilio, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, this is crucial. And we've been engaging with stakeholders, first at national level, through a number of dialogues. In the Brazilian case, we have a technical committee with around 120 people, and a political committee with around 100 participants involved. For the technical committee, including in the design of the scenarios themselves, we split in 5 groups: agriculture, forest and land use, industry, transport, energy supply and waste, and also an economic and social group. And the idea is that they discuss not only the storylines, but also the quantification of the storylines, how to include the quantitative assumptions and then discussing the results. And it is quite participative approach in the production of the scenarios themselves. And the political committee talks about barriers to implementation, the political acceptability, and from these feedbacks, sometimes we were able to draw new scenarios, and this has been channeled to a number of different political processes over time. DDP helped, for instance, since the discussion process of the Brazilian intended national determined communication, and throughout a number of other exercises with the participation of the government, business community, and NGOs and the scientific community as well. So this is absolutely crucial. In terms of international stakeholders, I think that the production of these reports and side events and sectoral analysis with cross-cutting results from different countries is very important. And we have organized discussions also with international stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Professor. Indeed, it's a really, really crucial aspect of your work. And Fran, I'll hand over to you because we don't have much time.
No, I just want to add, I completely agree with what Emilio said. It's very important, the diffusion, it's very important, the dialogue inside the country, the dialogue between the different stakeholders. There are different interests reflected in their visions, but one thing that is crucial, and maybe it's one of the supports that international community should face or should support, it's the strengthening of the energy, the in-country energy capacities for planning, for policy making. The energy ministries, we faced in the 90s a time in Latin America where the energy agencies and the energy ministries were erased, were taken out, because the idea was that the planning was not important because the market could resolve all the problems with the specific prices or with the specific regulations. And we see that this has some quite very difficult challenge to address, and linking that challenges with the topics that Daniel raised. It's crucial to have critical planning, to trying to comply all the objectives, being one of the objectives, the affordability and the development of our countries. So it's I think that this is a very important message to give. Thank you, Laurent.
Thanks, Fran. Indeed, a key example. I'll hand over to Hilton if and any other speaker, of course, who would like to speak on this question.
Thanks, Lauren. Just in 20 seconds, right from the beginning of this work on steel, we engaged with the steel industry, both nationally in South Africa and internationally. We engaged with financiers and we engaged with some government because we think that it's absolutely crucial that all of the parties that will be involved in implementing a solution are also involved in the analysis of the problem and in formulating the solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilton. I was just informed that we can go 5 minutes over time. So speakers, if you're able to stay for 5 more minutes, please stay. But if you have to go, we understand, of course. We have one more question that I think is also key to address on global cooperation and how it can take into account different social cultural contexts to develop climate strategies that are inclusive and effective. Speakers, I don't know who wants to take the floor first. Perhaps Johannes or Daniel. Johannes, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I mean, I don't have a specific geography in mind, but I think it's just to say very quickly that I think clearly this is key, and it's something that's done badly today, I think, or at least insufficiently. We see it when we look at, I mean, I work most on the land use sector, and there we see it in terms of the different approaches that are proposed to fund farmers in many different countries. Often do not take into account the kind of the local context of, in some countries, farmers having a clear lack of collateral, so a difficulty in accessing finance in the first place from the private market. I mean, without going further into this example, I just used it to underline that I think, simply put, if we don't manage to take this into account, we're not having international cooperation that is needs-based or very effective. So clearly that's key. I saw Fran then.
If I may, just a very small comment. I think it's time to act, and we all understand that the international cooperation is needed. We have in Argentina, and I know that in Mexico is the same, and in Brazil is the same. We all have national companies of energy. It's time to make agreements to specific investments in renewables, in hydrogen production, in iron ore production. We have the resources, we have the skilled people. We can start next year with this type of agreement. So it's time to put the money. It's not. I think the studies are most than enough. So it's time to act.
Thanks, Fran. Indeed, very much agree that it is time to. We can't wait anymore. Daniel, I hand over to you.
Thank you. And I'm basically going to agree with Fran. The way in which we can ensure this sort of sensitivity that was discussed is to continue to enable countries to develop their own plans. I think Fran's comment about the energy planning capabilities earlier is a very clear example of this, but there are many more. And we have to rapidly start getting the resources out there and also inviting people to participate in a different mindset. It's not easy to change mindsets, but if we show that this mindset allows a more inclusive way of working and bring people into the thinking and into the planning, then that's the way you can create the ownership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any last comments? Hilton or Emilio, please go ahead.
I will make a last comment. I think that our work in DDP in the iron and steel has shown very clearly, without any doubt, that there are win-win scenarios, that investment in decarbonization doesn't have to be seen as a burden. But to achieve that, we need the different national engagement in cooperative governance processes to recognize the very unbalanced nature often of the kinds of resources that different countries can bring just to negotiations. And not just the different socioeconomic conditions in the country, but also the kinds of teams and skills and resources that can be brought to the negotiations. So not just the substance of the negotiations, but the way that we cooperate. We need, if you look at Africa, and even South Africa, which is one of the more fortunate countries in South Africa, when we try and negotiate trade conditions or investment conditions, it's really it needs to be recognized that we don't have the same resources, and they need to be built in the country. They can't just be given, or it can't just be aid. We need to build them at bottom up, country owned. Thank you.
Yes, maybe if I may, we still have time. just would like to add that it's important to have a combination of different international cooperation initiatives together with the general approach of, say, the Green Climate Fund and other multilateral international organizations and development banks in order to provide substantial increase in capital flows from north to south. It's also important to complement that approach with some tailor-made, needs-oriented cooperation agreements, and maybe the example could be just in energy transition partnerships, but actually using a bottom-up approach coming from the needs in order to balance the concerns and possibilities of sustainable development in the South with the international support from the North.
I'm just going to jump in to say that I find it interesting that we're approaching, I've read a definition of capacity building by Yuba Sukuna as being not the ability to implement someone else's agenda, but the ability to set and pursue your own. And some of the statements here started to kind of line up behind that that quote. So I thought it good to mention it. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great, very interesting insights. I'll conclude here. I think this was a very nice conclusion to our event, this last question, with inputs from everyone. So we'll finish here. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you to the participants. And yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lauren, very much for excellent hosting.
Thank you.